Hello everybody, we are coming in for today's video, which it is November 10th of 2021. I was hoping to maybe get this one out yesterday, but things came up, so we're going to do it today. This is going to be kind of our relation video to the end of World War I, which I think is a topic I've not really entirely covered, all the chaos that happened after the end of that war and what kind of it set up in Europe and the global stage. So I think for some of our future videos coming up here, I do want to kind of cover some topics that emerged after the First World War, such as the Russian Revolution, the wars in Turkey, the isolationist stance the United States starts taking in the 1920s. What would be another thing? There's just all kinds of stuff that can really be covered. Of course, the Treaty of Versailles and the hyperinflation in Germany, which I think is going to be one of our sooner videos as we kind of come into the end of the year here. But anyway, today's video is in relation to the end of World War I, and we're going to be discussing the German Revolution that happened at the very end of the war in that started in November of 1918, and it largely continued until roughly about June of 1919. It was roughly about 6 months. So what happens with this revolution is this revolution takes place at the end of the war. It leads to a whole new system of government in Germany. It abolishes the old German Empire and the monarchy and establishes for the first time in Germany's modern history a democratic republic. Unfortunately, there are a lot of flaws in this republic that, given the right extremist groups and given the complications the republic was already encountering, kind of made it possible for extremists to gain political power, such as a certain guy wearing a swastika armband. But that is a topic probably for a later date. Today we're looking how Germany kind of transitioned from a monarchy, from this imperial empire, to its first democratic state. So, to really go here, you got to look at the conflict that started this whole process, and that is none other than the First World War that raged between 1914 and 1918. This was a 4-year-long war. At the time, this was the bloodiest war and most deadly war ever known to human history. World War II had not happened yet. So at the time, this was the war to end all wars, as it was also called, or the Great War. That's how people referred to it, because they never thought that conflict on this scale would ever be possible again in human history. World War I was the first time in modern history that we had a modern, full-on industrial war. In the past, modernization had kind of etched its way into the minds of warfare generals, such as modern weapons, such as proto-machine guns like Gatling guns. You had rifles coming in that were much more superior to muskets because they had grooved barrels and grooved bullets that actually made the trajectory a lot more accurate, but a lot more devastating. And unfortunately, during those earlier wars, such as the American Civil War would be one, where this modern technology was coming into play, the major problem you had was although the weapons had evolved, the warfare tactics had not, and there was still this use of gentleman's warfare, where the old style warfare, like back in the 1700s or so, where you line up in lines and just shoot, which is pointless because it makes absolutely no sense. But there was still this old outdated Napoleonic and gentleman's war tactics now being used in the late 19th century with this modernization of military technology. And World War I marked one of the first major global war, and I think the first global war in history, but it marks the first major big-time war in human history that significantly uses not only modern technology, but sees kind of the implementation of modern military tactics, such as entrenchment or bunker strongholds, retreat, and not lining up in a line. This sees the first major use of those tactics with the modern technology, and that's also part of the reason why it turns out to be so deadly, is because at the very beginning of the war, the tactics aren't not completely there. The tactics are still being updated, and at the beginning of the war, it's just a bloodbath, because, to put it bluntly, I think we all know, in the Western Front, around France and Belgium and Germany, it was trenches. They were entrenched, and they could not push each other back or out. And it was very much different than the late 19th century, because where you needed thousands of troops to kind of push someone away from the defensive position, the enemy would have to in turn put thousands of troops to defend a position. They realized pretty quickly that we can spare only maybe a couple hundred, put them in a trench, fortify it, put machine guns in it, and that would be all you need to stop an invading force, because they will get mowed down like grass when they come at you. They will be mowed down. Just, you could send thousands of troops at a couple hundred-man trench, and they will not be able to get through. And even if they do manage to get through, they're not going to be able to push you back a whole lot. They can push you back a little bit, but only maybe a mile or two, and then it's just not. But the effort and casualty rate that they will sustain doing that is not worth that risk. For a mile, you may lose a couple thousand men. That's what'd you gain? You just lost a couple thousand men. You could have lost a good section of your army, and you gained a mile in territory. It really was not efficient. But despite World War I's ferocity, World War I drags on for 4 years, and it takes a heavy, heavy toll on the nations that are taking part, and Germany is no exception. Germany is part of the Central Powers. It is dogged on two fronts. It's fighting Russia in the east, and it's fighting Britain and France to the west. In the west, it is a stalemate. It's trenches. In the east, the Germans are actually surprisingly kicking the Russians' butt. The Russians are weak. They are just helpless in this war. And by the end of the war, Germany, like the other nations, is exhausted. Its people are getting very weary. They are getting very just tired. They want the war to be over, but they don't want to surrender. They want to win, but they're like, come on, just someone else throw in the towel already. So that brings us to around 1917. Now, Germany at this time is a monarchy. It is the German Empire, as it is called, or also known as Imperial Germany, or the Second Reich. As the First Reich was known as the Holy Roman Empire, and of course, I think we all know, if you know anything about the Nazis, Hitler termed the Nazi regime as the Third Reich. The German Empire was the Second Reich. It existed between 1871 until the end of World War I. And it was ruled by a monarchy, by an emperor, who in German, the emperor is Kaiser. And in Germany, the Kaiser was Wilhelm II. Now, keep in mind that the Kaiser, Germany's empire, was made up of many different German states. Prussia was the most powerful and leading and dominant of these states, and automatically, whoever was the king of Prussia also was be given the title of German Emperor. So Wilhelm is not only the emperor of the German Empire, he's also the king of Prussia. So we come to 1917. The war is entering its last penultimate year, last full year, I should say, and the war in the West is a stalemate. And the country has entered a change because the previous 3 years have not really seen much change on the Western Front, and that is what's dogging the Germans down, and they want to break through the Western Front. The Germans tried to go through Belgium to get to Paris, and still they got bogged down. So by 1917, there's this push for a change in military strategy, and this comes that year when the country kind of enters a direct military rule under the joint leadership of General Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg and his associate general Erich Ludendorff, who kind of take over the reins of the government. They kind of basically rule Germany under a military dictatorship where even the Kaiser doesn't have much say. And this is all in an effort to try to turn Germany's military fortunes around and basically flip the war on its head that Germany is now going to win. The Kaiser, in the process, as we mentioned, he's kind of sidelined in the war's execution, but he basically received counsel from both Hindenburg and Ludendorff, who, although he might be sidelined, he's still the emperor. You still have to answer to the emperor. And they would still consult with the emperor over military strategy. In spring of 1918, the final year of the war, Germany launches the Michael Offensive, or Michael Offensive if you want to anglicize it, hoping to break the Allied lines in the West before the arrival of American troops. Now, where does this come from? In 1917, Russia undergoes the Russian Revolution, and Lenin and the Bolsheviks by the end of the year have taken power. and they immediately withdraw Russia from the war. The Bolsheviks do not want Russia in the war. It has devastated Russia. It's caused the downfall of the Tsar, and Lenin correctly sees that the best option here, in order to start building a Russian Bolshevik nation, which he's still having to contend with white armies that are supporting the Tsar, which leads to the Russian Civil War. Lenin decides, I need to end our participation in the big European war first before I can focus on that. So he immediately issues a decree after the October Revolution, says, I am taking Russia out of the war. I am willing to negotiate with the Germans for any terms that they want. In turn, they signed the Treaty of Brest-Leichovisk, Litfask, in the spring of 1918, which basically gives Germany a huge swath of Russian territory. They get Belarus, they get the Baltic states, they get Ukraine. They just get pretty much the whole, what would become the eastern part of the Soviet Union. In return, that Russia's out of the war, and Germany does not invade Russia any further. That ends the war on the Eastern Front, freeing over 100 military divisions of Germany on the east that they can now send to the Western Front, and the hope was, now that we have these free units, we can crash through the West and just break through the stalemate now that we no longer are fighting a two-front war. Unfortunately for the Germans, the bad news comes that same year, in 1917, the United States enters the war due to unrestricted German warfare on its merchant shipping, which also sinks American ships, which are officially neutral, and it finally kind of tips the balance of the war in the United States joining the Allies, which was also angered because Germany had made kind of this promise to Mexico that the United States got the telegram that Britain intercepted, the Zimmerman telegram, in which Germany basically was offering Mexico that if the United States goes to war with us, we are going to offer you an alliance, and if you go to war with the United States, we will help you regain your lost territories, mainly like the American Southwest, like Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California. Of course, this gets in the United States. The United States sees this on top of the unrestricted submarine warfare that Germany has resumed, and it's enough to convince both the president and Congress that Germany is no longer a European threat. It is a threat to American sovereignty, and thus they agree that, okay, we're going to war. So in 1917, the United States joins the war. However, American troops need to be mobilized, they need to be trained, and thus they don't really have any Americans over in Europe immediately. Germany knows this, and they realize that the Americans could be the tipping point in the war. So, in 1918, in the spring, while American troops are still getting ready to be sent to Europe, they come up with a plan that we need to bust through the Western Front now in the spring, because if we don't, the Americans are going to get here, and then we won't be able to launch an offensive like this again. We need to break through the Western Front before the Americans can arrive. So in the spring of 1918, they launched the Michael Offensive, which they hope will break through that line. Ultimately, it's a failure. They do push the British and the French back a ways, but it ultimately fails, and it gets pushed right back to its starting point. And this is the last major offensive for the Germans during the war. By August and September, American reinforcements have arrived in Europe, and by this time, the tide of the war turns. Britain, France, and the Americans are now pushing the Germans out of France and Belgium in the 100 Days Offensive in that September and August. Germany, in the meantime, it's struggling. It realizes it's lost the initiative, and now its focus is turning to a defensive to keep them out of Germany. Let's just keep them out of the country. They've never actually set foot in Germany, not like World War II. And this was part of the reason that Germany was falling back so easily was not just the American intervention, but keep in mind, Germany's been fighting the war for 4 years, and because of this attritional warfare, it's taken a very heavy physical and psychological toll on the German nation, and they're tired of it. They're worn out. Now, so are the British and French, but they're able to push forward because they got these fresh American doughboys, as they're somewhat referred to, coming over from the United States who haven't been bogged down in 4 years of war. They're brand new. They're wanting to fight. Germany at this time also has no reserves left. There's no extra troop divisions that they can bring up to reinforce certain important positions. And thus, there's also mass desertions because the troops are just sick of the war. They want it to be over, so they're deserting from the army. Now, Kaiser Wilhelm that year, in that fall, installs a new liberal government in Berlin headed by Chancellor Maximilian von Baden in the hopes that it will kind of appease the German people who have been calling for reform in Germany and calling for an immediate end of the war. So the Kaiser hopes this will kind of calm the German people down and we can just kind of go from there. He instructs von Baden and his government that the war is lost. We've lost the war at this point, and I want you to seek an immediate armistice with the Allies at almost any price that you can find. Now, negotiations end up stalling with the Allies because there is an insistence on two things. A, the Allies want to occupy Germany, which Germany argues that no, we have no purpose to let you occupy Germany because you have never set foot in German soil. So they automatically come to a disagreement on that. And the other thing is that the Allies kind of want to charge the Kaiser with war crimes. Now, whether or not he was applicable in that is another debate, but they wanted to basically charge the Kaiser with war crimes and bring him before a tribunal, which the Germans were not inclined to do either because they didn't really think that that was warranted. And they did not want the idea of the Kaiser being put on a trial by Allied leaders who would surely convict him of guilty, regardless of whether or not he was innocent or not. So this stalls negotiations with the Allies. In the meantime, the war is still going on, and everything starts turning to crap in October. On September 30th, Bulgaria surrenders, one of the other Central Powers. That October, on October 29th, the Ottoman Empire surrenders. The war in the south is now over in the Balkans, and now Germany and Austria-Hungary are now alone as the only two Central Powers left. Austria-Hungary is no longer really a fighting force at this time because it's different ethnicity groups, the Serbs, the Croatians, the Bosnians, they're all tearing each other apart. And they're separating and kind of forming their own nation states. The empire's falling apart at the seams. And on November 3rd, Austria-Hungary officially surrenders, even though technically it had already fallen apart by this point, which means Germany is now the only central power left in the war, which means it is now the focus of all Allied armies. On the same day of November 3rd, this is what starts the downfall of the German Empire finally, and the German Imperial Navy suffers a mutiny at the port of Kiel, which is in northern Germany, by its sailors on its ships, who refuse to partake in a proposed battle with the British fleet as a final battle between the British and German fleets. Admiral von Hipper, which is one of the top Navy admirals in the German Navy, he wants to kind of have this last climactic showdown between the British and the Germans on the high seas. The German sailors, who are worn out, who see no point in this because they know they're going to lose the war anyway, they basically say, why would I willingly go out there when I know the war is basically lost and all it's going to accomplish is more of us dead for no good reason? So the sailors mutiny. They refuse to sail, and they actually take over some of the ships in the harbor. Now, the sailors are only the start. They start a revolutionary uprising throughout Germany, and many uprisings also start springing up in major German cities, such as Hamburg, Munich, Brunswick, and Frankfurt. Bavaria, the state of Bavaria, which had its own semi-monarch of its own, also overthrows its monarch on that same day, and on November 4th proclaims that it is no longer part of the German Empire. Now, back in Berlin, the German capital, there is the major political party in the Reichstag, the German legislature, is the Social Democrats, but they are split into two factions. They are split into a pro-war faction and an anti-war faction. And the Social Democrats are the majority, and they also end up joining in the uprisings against the German government. Now, party leader Frederick Ebert originally plans to prevent a social revolution in the nation, but he soon advises Chancellor von Baden that unless the Kaiser abdicates soon, it will not be possible. He basically tells von Baden that either the Kaiser is going to have to abdicate or the people will not stop. They are sick of the war. They blame the Kaiser for the war's failure. And if you keep him in power, we're not going to win anything. So they basically tell him, either the Kaiser's got to abdicate or we're going to lose control of the situation. Your first step to gaining control over the German people is to get the Kaiser to give up his throne. He's no longer got any public support. Now, Kaiser Wilhelm is informed of this, and Hindenburg, his field marshal, kind of informs him that the military will not support to keep him on the throne anymore. The military has lost any support or anything it had for the Kaiser, and this cripples Wilhelm. He doesn't really want to abdicate, but he realizes that I have no one on my side that's going to be able to keep me on the throne if I really wish to. I've lost the support of the people, and I've lost the support of the army. So after he's informed of this, he abdicates on November 9th, and he flees to the neutral Netherlands, along with his sons. His sons also abdicate and say they will not take the throne either. The German monarchy is pretty much abolished by this point. Now, Chancellor von Baden, in response, he also ends up resigning, and before he resigns, he passes the position on to Frederick Ebert, the leader of the majority faction of the Social Democrats in the Reichstag. So Ebert is now the chancellor. On that same day, Karl Lipnick, a socialist who is also a communist, who had been jailed for a number of years and had founded what was known as the Spartacist League, began to proclaim Germany as a socialist republic, as a communist nation, because now the monarchy's gone. This was the heart of the German Empire, so we have no official head of state. So a new government's going to have to be formed, and Lipnick takes advantage of this. He has recently just been released from prison, and he says, oh, this is the perfect opportunity for me to stage a communist revolution, and I'll get support from the Russians right across the border, since they just kind of underwent their own. So he immediately plans to proclaim that Germany is now a socialist republic. Now, he later does do this, but not before someone else does. Now, when the Social Democrat deputy chairman Philip Scheidemann learns of this proposed proclamation that Lipnick is going to make, he realizes that he needs to do something before Lipnick does. And before Lipnick, later that on November 9th, he proclaims a socialist republic from the Berlin Palace that the Kaiser had once inhabited. Earlier that day, Scheidemann proclaims from the Reichstag to a crowd assembled outside, out one of the windows, that Germany, the establishment of a German republic, not a socialist republic, just a republic. And the crowd outside the Reichstag goes nuts. So he basically beats Lipnick to the punch, saying, I've already proclaimed a government. You have no authority here. Now, this goes against. Now, Scheidemann's proclamation of a republic went against Ebert's wishes, as he had not hoped to entirely have to get rid of the Kaiser. The Kaiser had abdicated, but his hope was that maybe I can institute a constitutional monarchy where the Kaiser can still retain his throne, but he has a lot significant less power, kind of like Britain. Unfortunately, now that Scheidemann has promised the German people and proclaimed that a German republic is now in effect, he realizes he can't just go back on that statement because the people would probably uprise against his government now. And now he feels that he's obligated to fulfill the promise of a republic. He cannot do the constitutional monarchy like he originally wanted to do. So Ebert, on the afternoon of November 9th, tries to form a provisional government to kind of hold things down until an official government can be set up with a new constitution and everything. And he persuades the independent Social Democrats, who were not in the majority, and these have been the Social Democrats who had opposed the war, to provide 3 members in conjunction with the majority Social Democrats in order to form this provisional government, to try to incorporate them together. Now, Ebert promised to have a council of people's commissioners and a social democratic republic. He promised that this was going to happen, that the process will be a democratic process, and we will set up a social democratic republic in the empire's place. Now, he hoped that elections would establish a purely democratic republic, because they're going to hold elections to determine party officials and what kind of government the German people want. Now, the left-leaning, independent Social Democrats, they want a socialist Räterepublik, which the provisional government created, but divided that up currently. They want more in lines somewhat with communism, but not all the way. Now, the war ends 2 days after this, on November 11th, as the provisional government kind of instructs citizens, literally, to approach the Allied leaders on the Western Front and try to get an armistice signed, which happens on November 11th, which is why we celebrate Armistice Day / Veterans Day. And on November 11th, 1918, they sign the armistice, and World War I officially comes to an end at 11 a.m. that morning. However, the final treaty has yet to be made. This just brings an end to the fighting. With the signing of the armistice, the Allies basically are not going to invade Germany. However, since the war is not officially over, the Allies still maintain their troops on the right on the fringe of the German border, saying if you make one wrong move, we will start up again. And they maintain their Allied blockade of Germany's coast, which also causes major food and supply shortages during the winter of 1918, which had already been they had already been going through supply shortages for a number of years since the beginning of the war, but by this point the German people have nothing to go off of, and this was not helping the situation back home. Not to mention, they also had flu epidemics, and they had shortages of fuel, such as coal, in order to keep their houses warm. And thousands are now jobless when they're going home, the soldiers. Now, Lipnick was angered by the exclusion of his Spartacists from the government. They were entirely excluded from the provisional government that was set up under Ebert's direction. On January 6th, he decides, I'm going to take matters in my own hands. The provisional government's not really powerful. I can easily overthrow it, and I can still establish this socialist republic that I want. And on January 6th of 1919, Lipnick and his Spartacists, with his leader Rosa Luxemburg, who was a woman, surprisingly, which was rare back then to have a revolutionary leader who was a woman. Him and Luxemburg and their Spartacist followers, who are now known as the Communist Party of Germany, begin massive demonstrations in Berlin, and they seize key government and communications centers in the city, such as railway stations, radio stations, anywhere they can get a hold of, government buildings. And they are encouraged by, of course, the Soviet Russians in Russia, the Bolsheviks, and it ultimately doesn't go as strongly as the Spartacists would have hoped, because there's really no mass support in Germany in early 1919 for communism. There's really no support other than the Spartacists themselves, and they need outside support to kind of gain this. Most German citizens that are not Spartacists favor the Social Democrats, either the independent ones or the majorities. The German army, in response to this, had trained volunteer units that they called Freikorps to suppress revolutionary activity, to kind of aid the government in its post. And they use over 3,000 of these Freikorps to put down the Spartacist uprising. And there is gunfighting in the streets, literally. The Spartacist militias tried having gun battles in the streets of Berlin with the provisional government's troops, trying to seize power. Lipnick eventually is captured, and so is Luxemburg, and they're both executed on January 15th. This puts the Spartacists leaderless, and it kind of crumbles the whole League's organization. They've lost their two figureheads. Excuse me. In Bavaria, a socialist republic is proclaimed in April, similar along the lines of what Lipnick had hoped to do in the entire German state, but the Freikorps put that one down as well when they come down into Bavaria in May. In all, in the Spartacist Uprising, as it was called, the government lost 17 troops in total, and the Spartacists lost between 130 and 180. And this is not counting the civilians who innocently got caught in the crossfire. On January 19th of 1919, 4 days after the execution of Lipnick and Luxemburg, the first German elections end up being held. This is also the first time that German women get to vote. So this is a significant change already for social status, because in the old German Empire, women could not vote. So this is the first time for German women that they are actually getting to exercise a democratic right and kind of bolster support a little bit for a democratic republic regime. Support is thrown to the political parties who are in favor of making Germany a democracy, such as the Social Democrats, who ironically still exist today, and I think as of the last German election that just happened a month or two ago, they just regained the majority in government. On February 6th, an assembly begins to meet at the city of Weimar in order to avoid any further revolutionary activity that is going on in Berlin. They want to craft a new government, but Berlin's still got some revolutionaries running around causing chaos, so they deem, let's go to a smaller city where there's not so much revolutionary activity, where we can relatively draw up this new government in private and peace. And the meeting at Weimar, eventually, the assembly declares its sovereignty over all of Germany and basically comes up with a constitution. Frederick Ebert becomes the first president of the Weimar Republic, as it becomes known. Scheidemann is elected as the chancellor to Ebert. And despite the regime change that occurs in Germany, that Germany is now a democratic republic, which if I'm not wrong, was part of President Woodrow Wilson's 14 points that he had dictated, that he would like to see Germany turn into a democratic republic in order to fully negotiate with Germany. Germany has now fulfilled this. They're a democratic republic. The Allies seemingly don't care. They are so bent, the European ones at least, are so bent on revenge that they don't even care that the Germans are now a democratic republic and have gotten rid of the old imperial regime that they have been fighting against anyway. They're so bent on revenge that they still make this Weimar Republic sign the very harsh Treaty of Versailles in June of 1919, which we will cover in a later video, which kind of cripples the Weimar Republic. It started with good intentions, but ultimately that treaty cripples it to a point that it allows for Adolf Hitler to seize power during the early 1930s. In July, the Constitution is officially complete and establishes the full-on Weimar Republic in Germany, which is the first democratic republic in Germany's history. Now, what does this Constitution do? Now, what the Constitution does, it changes a little bit of the social order in Germany, because it does one major change. In the old German Empire, you had the nobles, you had the nobility, you had the monarch. The nobility, gone. They're wiped out. They no longer exist. Nobility are abolished in Germany. There is now a popularly elected president who holds power over the country, and he holds power over foreign policy and the military and has emergency decree powers that he can use. The president nominates the chancellor, who needs approval of the lower house of parliament, or the Reichstag, in order to take office. The members of the Reichstag are elected through universal suffrage, meaning both men and women can vote, and it is proportional representation. They are voting for parties, and based on what party gets the most votes, or what percentage of votes each party gets, they will divide those seats up in the government between the different parties, and those parties can then choose, okay, they're told that based on the percentage of the popular vote, your party received this much percent, which means you get converted into this many seats in the legislature. The party then gets the choice over which party members they want to have fill those seats that they're allotted. Now, the Reichsrat is the upper house of the legislature, and the delegates are not elected by popular election here. They are appointed by the governments of the federal states, such as Prussia or Bavaria or some of the independent cities. By August 11th of 1919, the Constitution is finalized, which officially ends the provisional government in Germany that had taken place almost a year before. So, this kind of is the transition from a direct monarchy / somewhat dictatorship toward the very end, with the military kind of calling the shots, to a democratic republic, which is significant because, keep in mind, out of the chaos of World War I, that was one of the main aims of the United States going to war, was we wanted democracies to be able to thrive and flourish. And this comes about in one of the least likely countries it would have been thought of that it would have happened. However, the weaknesses of this regime, given that it's so new, it's so weak from the war, and then the Allies slap on these heavy, heavy punishments on it during the Treaty of Versailles, it just cripples this republic in the years to come, which we will cover here in a video that will be coming out here soon. But it was a noble idea for a new democratic republic in a state that had really never known democracy, but at the same time, it ends up being its undoing just due to the timing. So here we have some photos. Here we have a photograph of Kaiser Wilhelm II, who was the last German emperor. He fled into exile into the Netherlands after he abdicated, and he did not die until 1941. He is still buried in the Netherlands because his wish was that he did not want to be buried in Germany. He did not want his body moved back to Germany until the monarchy was restored. I would hate to tell him that as of today, Germany's monarchy is still not in power. It's still not restored over 113 years later. Image of Chancellor Max von Baden, who kind of was appointed by the Kaiser, who basically started the process that, okay, the Kaiser's going to have to abdicate or we're not going to get anywhere. And after the Kaiser abdicated, he ended up resigning himself. He was the last Imperial German Chancellor. Photograph of some of the sailors during the Kiel Mutiny on November 3rd of 1918, where the sailors basically refused to sail out. They refused to follow the orders of their commanding officers and said, we're not going for this all death match where we're all just going to get killed for no good reason because the war's pretty much lost. It is lost. Why would we risk our lives just to have this big old grand theatric battle with the British at the end of the war? Here we have the picture of, you can't really pinpoint where he is. I mean, you can see the figures up here in the window, but this is the picture of the proclamation of a German Republic at the Reichstag, where you see the crowd outside the building here after the Kaiser is abdicated, and Philipp Scheidmann would be up here. I can't tell which figure is him, but he's one of these figures up here proclaiming from the window that we are now a German Republic. This is a headshot of Scheidmann, who was the Social Democrats party chairman, and then he later became the first chancellor of the Weimar Republic. Here we have Karl Lipnick, who was the leader of the Spartacist Uprising, along with Rosa Luxemburg, who was his co-leader, who was a woman. And he was primarily the architect of the Spartacist Uprising. He was the one that tried to proclaim Germany a socialist democratic republic. He was a communist, and he ended up being executed in January after he was captured by government troops, just before the elections occurred. Here we have Frederick Ebert, who was the main party leader of the majority faction, had supported the war. He later became the main leader of the provisional government, and after the Weimar Republic was established, he became its first president until he died, I think, around 1925. And just to show here this one, we have a photo of the government troops. Keep in mind that when the Spartacist Uprising happened in Berlin, it was basically seizing the major points in the city that could control access, such as government buildings, railway stations, radio stations, anywhere that had communication or government significance. This is an image of the government troops, the Free Corps, guarding one of the Berlin railway centers in Berlin in 1919 during the Spartacist Uprising. This would have been about January, but these are government troops. These are the provisional government, where they're kind of, you can see they're very much mobile. It looks like they're in the middle of a war, and they pretty much were. They were still pretty much in this war mentality and were using military-grade weapons to put down this uprising. And in comparison, I have one right over here. Give me a second. This is an image of on one of the streets of Berlin of some Spartacist militia who are kind of barricading, guarding a street that they kind of control in Berlin at the time. This was the Socialists. This was the Communists that the German government was fighting. The provisional government was having to fight against. These were Lipnick's followers, who were put down after their failed coup, pretty much. But that pretty much wraps up that video. It's not really, the German Revolution is kind of short, but it's interesting for what it creates and for the what it's going to help lead to, which we will cover here sometime in the future. Which I know in the past I have covered Hitler's rise to power, but I'm thinking of possibly redoing that video again, just because I think I could deliver it a little better this time than I did initially. It was like, I think, my second or third video I ever did. But regardless, we will have a video here sometime soon about the Treaty of Versailles and the hyperinflation that kind of ensues in Germany, just the chaos that kind of befalls the Weimar Republic that kind of cripples it and leads to extremist groups to kind of gain a foothold, such as the Nazi Party, which I think we all know what that leads to. But as for this, I just wanted to kind of hit this topic as I like German history. I actually study it a little bit along with American history. And this, I kind of covered World War I last year because of the presentation slideshow I put up. So I wanted to do something that was still related to World War I since, of course, November 11th was the day that it ended. And this was just something that I figured would be worth talking about. It's not something that's commonly known. So that pretty much wraps it up for today. Tomorrow, of course, it's not only the historical anniversary, the end of the First World War, but it is also, of course, Veterans Day. So do remember that if you know a veteran, if you see a veteran, be sure to thank them for their service. Be sure to thank them for their service to their country. They have done so much that you cannot even imagine, that most of us cannot even imagine doing. I can't even imagine doing it half the time. But make sure you come across a veteran tomorrow, thank them for their service, be it someone you run into in the store, be it you run into them at a restaurant, be it's a family member, a friend, whoever it may be. Make sure that you thank them for their service because they have given so much for this country that we cannot even imagine, and other countries too. And if you live in one of the countries that still observes Armistice Day, be sure to remember the end of World War I, as I will also pay time to remember. If you have a poppy pin, wear a poppy pin. But that basically wraps up today's video. So we will be back with our next video, I'd say next week. So we will hopefully see you all then. As always, like, subscribe, put comments in the questions in the section below, and do not feel afraid to give any suggestions that you may have for future videos. So that ends our little video today on the German Revolution of 1918 and 1919. And hopefully everyone has a good rest of their week, and we will see you all back here next week with the next video. May God bless you all.